Both Ray Dalio and Michael Burry are concerned about the U.S. big debt problem. Recently, Michael Burry tweeted about how you ever wonder why doomsday scenarios so rarely come true in your life on this earth. Because debt. Yes, Michael Burry, always the rainbows and sunshine optimist, tweeting about how U.S. debt is just exploding, effectively talking about how record debt to GDP, how debt has just continued to reach new levels around 140%. And for the past 2 decades, debt has fueled much of U.S. economic growth. This means the U.S. will either face lower growth, even higher debt burdens, or will need to be more productive in the years ahead to sort of deal with this debt burden. Dalio is effectively making the same point. He's saying most people are focused on the short-term debt cycle, which lasts every 5 to 10 years, but most people haven't lived through the long-term debt cycle, which happens close to every 100 years, give or take. And this is the same point Dalio has made, saying, look, it's not a doomsday scenario. This is just something that plays out every 100 years, every 150 years, and you should adjust accordingly. This is reality as it is. You don't need to say the sky is falling. You just say, hey, this is a problem. I'm not trying to put down Michael Burry. I think he's one of the greatest analysts ever. I think sometimes he uses a little bit of strong language like doomsday scenario, but this is just a real challenge, and try to adjust yourself accordingly. Bridgewater has done so. They're up 30% this year, saying, hey, we think we're going to be living through stagflation for some time. And so the challenge that Ray Dalio calls out is this long-term debt peak happens when debt repayments start growing faster than income, because then you really start having a challenge of, well, how am I going to cover this debt? And looking at what's gone on with U.S. and U.S. debt spending is you look at $1 to $2 trillion in annual deficit spending historically for the last, few decades. And that's really challenging, saying, well, where's that going to go from here? And you look at the Congressional Budget Office. So this is the U.S. government. They're effectively saying the debt relative to GDP on a deficit per year is going to range from 5 to 10% of GDP going forward. So that's a real big problem. So saying debt will continue to effectively explode as a percentage of GDP, and saying, hey, these debt burdens will continue to get bigger and bigger, higher and higher. This once again from the Congressional Budget Office saying, hey, we don't think these problems are going to get solved, partly because it's a wonder of like, well, who are we going to cut which department is going to get the spending cut from? Is it, unemployment benefits, Social Security, health? Where do we cut it? Veterans benefits? Where is the palatable cut, and which politician will have effectively the honor and, the being straightforward with the public to say, hey, we can't afford what we're currently doing. $1 to $2 trillion in annual deficits won't work going forward. And you overlay this with the fact that the Federal Reserve, having to deal with higher inflation, is just starting to deal with quantitative tightening. So this is really the challenge, where short-term debt cycles, as explained by Ray Dalio, is sort of where you can constantly, the total debt grows over time, but the short-term debt cycle is when the central bank can lower or raise interest rates, that sort of drives the economy. The long-term debt cycle is where you have this challenge where debts have become so big that moving the interest rate just doesn't do enough anymore, and now it's about printing money to effectively solve your problems, or trying to, repay and pay down that debt over time. And arguably, you're now at this point where the Federal Reserve is starting to trim their balance sheet, their $9 trillion balance sheet. So this creates extra pressure on U.S. debt, because you have the U.S. Treasury that's, let's say, issuing $1 to $2 trillion a year, and you don't have the Federal Reserve that's eager to effectively step up and buy that, like's happened, like, you can see what's happened for large chunks of the last, 2 decades, where the Federal Reserve would effectively step up and say, yes, we can buy, effectively the Federal Reserve would, from one hand to the other, the U.S. Treasury would issue the debt, and then the Federal Reserve would say, okay, we'll buy that debt. Well, now the Federal Reserve, with inflation where it is, says, okay, we need to do monetary tightening. So this is additional pressure on the U.S. debt markets, which could result in higher interest rates and broad pressure on risk assets in the United States. And that does create, a challenge. So the question is, where do assets go from here? What does this sort of mean for the economy? What does the U.S. government even do about these debts? Well, if you're looking for compelling investment ideas or want to take charge of your investment journey, consider unrivaledinvesting.com. Full disclosure, this is not financial advice. So Ray Dalio pencils out a few different ways that governments have historically dealt with the long-term debt cycle. One is defaulting. that obviously is extremely painful and shouldn't be considered, because the reality is this, U.S. debt is oftentimes the asset of someone else. So if the U.S. government debt defaults, or another, major government defaults, well, that means whoever owns it now, they're at risk of defaulting as well, because they just lost an asset that's not necessarily repaying them. So as that happens, you create a daisy chain effect. It leads to really, really big problems. Another way to try to solve it is higher taxes. You're seeing investments to sort of beef up the IRS. The challenge with this approach is you're just sort of shifting around the pie, and you're not necessarily solving the structural problems of saying, hey, is this intelligent spend, this $1 to $2 trillion deficit spending? Is this intelligent? Is there a better way that we can spend this in the future? And that actually gets to the next point of lower spending, is maybe with really intelligent, analysis of sort of saying, hey, how should we spend our money? How should we spend, what is an appropriate deficit dollar spent? And you might have technological progress in the years ahead. You might have the analysis. There might be ways to lower spending in the years ahead. I show a picture of a robot here. Maybe it's pie in the sky, but I'm a bit of an optimist on this point, where I think long term, maybe it's over the next 5, 10, 20 years, you do see more artificial intelligence rolled out. You see more, let's say potentially robotics rolled out. And with those types of things, you could see huge advances, huge progress. Let's say, healthcare spending, most folks don't realize that something like 70, 80% of all spend occurs during, let's say, the last few years of someone's life. So if you're able to either catch the problems earlier or diagnose it in a healthy way, maybe you're able to lower spending significantly. Another thought process is you have a lot of, care that has to deal with end-of-life care and child care. And this could potentially help, individuals with, potentially robotics, in both situations, but not so sure how excited people are about the Westworld scenario and sort of a hospice scenario, in a hospice setting, having robots help around. But maybe this is just my own, pie in the sky scenario. But, Ray Dalio makes a point that really what ends up happening in all these situations is you have higher inflation. And this is sort of the way of the government printing money to sort of get their way out of this. And this is the part of the reason why I'd argue that Bridgewater says, yeah, we're in for a period of stagflation, because if the US government really, really wants to tackle inflation, it's going to mean a huge constraint on growth, a huge hit to risk assets. We haven't even seen it yet. If we really tackle inflation and, let's say, bring inflation to 1 to 2%, you're going to be looking at like depressionary type of setup in the US based on how much monetary tightening you would need to see. That's effectively what Ray Dalio's Bridgewater has articulated in the past. And I've called out that in some prior videos. So if the US government isn't willing to go, particularly the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell isn't willing to go to that length, that amount of pain to bring inflation under control, then you're probably going to go through a sustained period of elevated inflation. So that's, but that period of elevated inflation also does help reduce the debt. Arguably, if the economy is, let's say, growing, it's phony baloney growth because it's primarily inflation, so effectively, or if prices are going up, 5, 6, 7, 8% a year, but debt is only growing 3% or 4 or 5% a year, then your debt balance relative to GDP is actually going down over time. So that is sort of the trick that governments do over time. And that's how Ray Dalio frames it. He's saying, look, you have these different paths. There'll be some mixture of all of them, but the reality is inflation is generally what you're going to see, and to expect it, going forward. And so if you enjoyed this video, talking about how both Ray Dalio and Michael Burry share the same concern about U.S. big debt problems, please make a point of hitting that thumbs up, hit that subscribe button, and thank you for watching Unrivaled Investing.